Yep, we're doing another unboxing, although this one's kind of interesting because it doesn't actually come in a box. This is Pinball Construction Set, and as you can see, instead of a box, we've got this sort of, well, I guess the closest approximation would be like a record case, because it's not really that big. And this is actually how, Electronic Arts distributed all of their software way back in like the early 80s and mid 80s and such. I don't remember when exactly they stopped, but this is actually some pretty cool stuff here, because what it is you open it up, and there you go. You got the game on a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk right there, tucked in its little own pouch, and you got more details about the game up there with some screenshots. And it even folds open again, showing you, well, more of this guy. I think that's Bill Budge there, the guy who came up with this game. And now you may be wondering to yourself, well, for a game like this, made back in the 80s, you got all this promotional stuff here, like these screenshots and everything. Where's the manual? This is where it gets really interesting. The manual is right in here. How freaking cool is that? They managed to turn this front part right here into its own little pouch. So you've got the disc in its little pouch right there. You've got the manual right here. And the manual is actually not that thick either. It's got just some basic information about how to run the program and everything. And it even has like a part list on the back there, so that you have a quick reference for what everything is in case you don't have it memorized. So, yeah, these things were seriously cool. I actually did have one of these back in the day for a deluxe paint, the very first one released for DOS, but that got lost a long time ago. So I'm glad to have one of these again. But yeah, there's not really much else to say about it. So let's actually take a look at how this thing works. So yeah, Pinball Construction Set looks severely outdated to the untrained eye. But what makes this program fascinating is that it was not only the very first pinball game ever made which allowed users to custom make their own tables, it may even be the first game creation system ever developed which can produce its own executable command files to be run independently of the main program, thus allowing users to distribute the tables they make without having to include any special or pirated material. Because it was pushing so much new ground though, it's also very rough around the edges and has a number of minor bugs. Not too surprising in itself, but what really surprised me is that there was never a follow-up. This game received excellent reviews all across the board, so why did it never get a sequel with more parts, better physics, and fewer issues? We may never know, but the point still stands that for all the issues this program did have, it was incredibly unique and stayed unique all the way up to the release of Macadam Bumper, aka Pinball Wizard, which, now that I've played PCS, was clearly a blatant and worse playing ripoff of this thing, even if it did look better. Pinball Construction Set was envisioned and primarily developed by Bill Budge, operating under the company name BudgeCo, and while the original Apple II release all the way back in 1982 was published by BudgeCo itself, Electronic Arts was given publishing rights not long following, both for the Apple II version and for numerous other ports, with the PC booter port coming out in 1985. Yeah, this isn't technically a DOS game, although the tables it can compile are run from DOS. We'll get into this. It's a 1 to 4 player pinball program with support for CGA 4 color, Tandy 16 color, and technically also EGA 16 color graphics, all running at 320 by 200 resolution, along with PC speaker sound effects. Now, I should point out that the Tandy support is largely undocumented, as the game itself simply makes mention of needing an IBM color graphics adapter, but you can cycle various aspects of the color palette in Tandy and EGA modes by pressing Ctrl-Q. As for EGA, it's not technically supported by the game and seems to be a case of incidental forwards compatibility, given what I've been told about how the palette cycling was coded into this thing. All that said, no matter which mode you're in, the game never actually shows more than 4 colors on screen at a time. As for its current release date, it's actually kind of ambiguous. Bill Budge freely released the source code for the original Apple II and Atari 800 versions of the game about 4 years ago, so anyone with the ability to compile that would be able to use this program for free. But only source for those versions were released, so technically the PC booter version is still commercial software. But at the same time, there's very little functional difference between the various ports of the game out there, so In any case, if you want a physical copy, well, much to my surprise, this is one of the easier 80s commercial titles to get a hold of. Sellers tend to call this thing rare, but fully sleeved copies, as it were, show up every so often and tend to go for between $10 and $30 depending on which port it is, with the PC booter port being one of the more expensive ones and the C64 port being one of the least expensive ones. It's still not super common though, so if you don't find the exact version you want, you'll need to be a little patient in your searches, and also be extremely careful about getting the exact version you want, as the packaging for every version is virtually identical, and it's really easy to get them mixed up. So before we talk about the table creation process and how it works, let's actually go over how this thing plays. Now, each table is made up of polygon shapes, parts, and artwork. The flippers are controlled with the shift keys, with left shift also firing any plungers, while the arrow keys adjust the strength of the plungers. Before beginning a round of play, you can use the right shift key to select the number of players, and left shift to actually start the game. At the side of the screen are the current scores of each player, as well as a quote-unquote back glass for the table being played. Between the scores and the back glass is the current bonus amount, the multiplier which will be applied to the bonus when the ball drains, and the number of balls left, including the one currently in play. As you can see, all games are played out as 5-ball games, and there's no way to adjust this in the settings. Actually, speaking of not being able to adjust things, one fundamental pinball action is missing from this game, and that's nudging. Being able to nudge a table in real life is how you ultimately keep a ball going and become a pinball wizard yourself. The wizardry is in mastering the art of affecting the ball's trajectory in a positive way through both manipulating the flippers and the machine as a whole. The lack of nudging means that if a ball goes somewhere you don't want it to go, you have no means of saving it, and are thus at the mercy of random chance a huge portion of the time. And in line with that, Juan Bourbano sent this comment in. One thing I've noticed while playing a number of tables made with the Pinball Construction Set is that collision detection is very random, on one moment off the next, particularly with flippers and lane guides. In some cases, the ball can get stuck for good, abruptly ending gameplay. Well, from what I know of how the internals work, the collision detection actually has nothing to do with the pixels on screen and everything to do with the coordinates of the balls relative to the walls and parts. So what can end up happening is the ball can end up moving in a way which lodges it between two parts of collision which are counteracting each other, causing the ball to become stuck, or sometimes the ball may end up hitting two different walls at the same time, each of which has its own idea of how the ball should deflect away. Thankfully, there is some randomness in the physics, so even if it looks like the ball's in an infinite loop or something, it may still free itself on its own accord. And as far as the physics are concerned, they're far better than those found in Macadam Bumper, but they're definitely not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Now, something I brought up back in my Macadam Bumper review is that digital pinball simulations can't really be approached or played with the same mentality as real pinball, since the physics are never 100% accurate. Instead, you have to approach them as their own things, with their own physics which need to be adapted to. However, because the physics here aren't that bad, it's easier to adapt to them. The collision quirks, though, can ultimately get annoying, especially with how slow the flippers move and how little power the flippers tend to have as a result of that, with the ball sometimes phasing straight through a flipper because the collision detection glitches out. Now, making a table with Pinball Construction Set is actually pretty intuitive. On the right side of the screen is your selection of parts, as well as some tools you can use for manipulating polygons, and commands for interacting with the system and making adjustments. Well, let's actually go over what each of these parts are. First up, we have two sizes of flippers and the ball itself. You have to indicate where your ball will be deposited at the start of play, and you can put more than one ball in, keeping in mind that all balls must drain before the next ball begins, and that all of the preset balls will return to their original locations. Next, we have some pre-configured polygons, including a black rectangle and 4 wire guides, all of which can be manipulated using the polygon editing tools, which from top to bottom below the selection cursor are Move Node, Cut Node, Add Node, and Paint, with the Paint option utilizing the color selectors below. Next, we have some bumpers of varying sizes and shapes. Hitting these will cause the ball to be flung off at high speed, depending on the table settings. While they do have a fixed look, you can repaint things later on, keeping some limitations in mind. Next, we have slingshots in the traditional wedge shape, which are usually used near the in lanes. And next to that, we have horizontal and vertical kickers and the plunger, with the kickers functioning similarly to the bumpers above. Next up are the drop targets. Each bank of drops has 4 which need to be hit to complete the bank and trigger gate conditions, which we'll get into soon. The spinner here scores points over and over again based on how fast the ball was moving when it hit it. The multi-ball trough will lock up 2 balls, and if you manage to get a third ball into it, all 3 are released into play simultaneously. This aspect is actually kind of buggy, since while multi-ball is going, you can still lock balls into this, and it may start losing track of how many balls are in play, which can end up ending a ball prematurely when one drains. Next are Gobble Holes, though the game has another name for them even though everyone into pinball calls them Gobble Holes. These are a holdover from old gambling pinball games, as if the ball goes into one, it ain't coming back. Gobble Holes typically award huge amounts of points on a real pin, given that they effectively end your ball, but again, scoring is something we'll address when we get into the more intricate details of this program. Next is the magnet, which, quite honestly, barely has much of an effect in this program, at least with typical table settings. I also don't like the fact that it's situated on the playfield as a solid object, as in a real pinball machine, if any magnets are utilized, it's always under the playfield, and usually triggered on or off by some sort of mechanism. Now, these are just solid shapes which act the same as polygon walls, while these are one-way gates which only allow the ball to pass through in the direction the arrow is pointing in. These are rollovers, which are triggered 1 or more times by having the ball simply roll over top. And finally, these are stand-up targets, which you simply hit to trigger points. Now, placing parts in polygons is all well and good, but scoring is important to any pinball game. So by accessing the AND gate function, you can go to the under-table wiring, as it's referred to by the game. While this is meant to look all intricate and complex, it's actually extremely simplified. You can assign a base score value and one of 7 sound effects to all objects on the playfield, plus you can set up to 6 bonus conditions, where hitting 1 to 3 of the parts selected can trigger an increase in the bonus multiplier and or award a number of bonus points which would be multiplied by that bonus multiplier. While this screen looks somewhat straightforward, it does have some curiosities. Firstly, in order to connect certain parts to certain AND gates for assigning bonus conditions, you first select the gate to modify, then use the wire clipper and screwdriver tools on specific parts, with the screwdriver connecting parts to the gate and the clippers removing the part. Secondly, if you accidentally assign a bonus multiplier or sound effect to something and want to remove them, you first put the cursor over the selection in question, hold the action button down, which I neglected to mention is the keypad insert key, then move the cursor off of the selection while still holding this button down. Kinda weird like that, but at least it works. The most unusual part of this whole process, though, are the score and bonus amounts that you can choose from. And remember that pinball in the form we all know of with flippers and such had been around for decades prior, and less cumbersome and more dynamic scoring from the mid-60s onwards, so there were solid precedents in place in regards to how scoring should be done. However, here in PCS, you can only set score amounts of 10 points to 1500 points for normal gameplay, where for bonuses, you can go from 1000 to 100,000 points, which is completely contrary to any sort of balanced scoring. I mean, I get what was being aimed for here, but setting up decent scoring in this program is a pain because of these restrictions. The main table screen also has an option for adjusting various sliders, which affect gravity, speed, kick, and elasticity. Gravity is how quickly the ball will be pulled towards the bottom, speed is how fast the ball will move in general, kick is how powerful any kicker, bumper, or slingshot will be, while elasticity is how much bounce the ball gets when it hits any other solid object, such as polygon walls, lane guides, etc. And once your table's in good shape, that's when it's time to start painting, because holy Jesus, this part tedious. So, for some bizarre reason, you're not able to paint directly onto the point your cursor is on. Instead, you have to first zoom into a certain spot, and then you can paint in pixels in the magnified view. This is a really slow and painful process, especially given the lack of mouse support in this program. Though I think this program predates mice made for DOS systems, so not really all surprised there. And I should also point out that you can paint onto the playfield too. Any paints you add to the playfield will not affect the ball in any way. The only thing you have to be careful of though is that you may start running into memory limits. Sort of. See, here's the thing. This game has a bit of a bug in that there's plenty of memory made available for parts and painting and whatnot, but it's all saved to disk in the order it was created in, and there's a 4 kilobyte limit as to how much data can actually be saved or loaded. So when you go to load back up a table which has exceeded this limit, anything created after the limit was reached will be missing, which not only includes sections of paint, but also parts. This is why it's often recommended to finish the table proper first and add the paint afterwards, so that if you do hit the save file limit, you'll be missing some of the paint as opposed to some of the playfield. The other thing too is that this only affects save files, not executables. So if you create an executable file of your table to be run separate from the program, it shouldn't be missing anything. And that's the last feature to touch on really, is the ability to make standalone table files. The ability to do this led to all sorts of pinball tables being circulated around, and thus finding tables made with this program on shareware disks and such was a really common thing. In fact, for the 2 tables I made over the course of this review, I've made them available to download on my website in my miscellaneous stuff section. Plus I'll have links to them in the video description too. Pinball Construction Set was charting some seriously innovative ground, and while it's definitely outdated by today's standards, it was a very popular program back in the day that all kinds of people either had the full program of, or at least one standalone table made with it. If you can source a copy of this thing, or don't mind fiddling with source code and emulators for machines other than DOS PCs, I'd say check this thing out. In contrast with Macadam Bumper, which was made to be a clearer ripoff of this program than I've seen this thing, Macadam has better graphics by far and stronger features for the ones that it has. But PCS has multi-ball, the ability to make standalone tables, and just better physics and gameplay overall. There's just a couple catches. One major, one severe. So you may want to keep 2 versions of DOSBox on hand for running this thing. The latest version of DOSBox, as of this recording, 0.74, runs this program the best and properly supports its Tandy color mode. However, attempting to make standalone executables will lock the thing up. For making standalone executables, you need to use DOSBox 0.73. However, this will break Tandy color support to the point where the background color changes fine, but none of the foreground colors do. The other more serious issue is that this was a PC booter game, and was thus never really meant to be run on a hard drive. So unless you source a cracked version which will run on a hard drive, just getting this thing running in DOSBox can be a pain, as you have to mount the game disk as A drive and run it through DOSBox's ability to boot a PC booter game. And on top of that, the original disk has disk-based copy protection, so basically running this game from an original disk in DOSBox is near impossible. Once you do get it working though, all you have to do with the DOSBox configuration file is set cycles to a comfortable value. 230 will approximate how fast this game would have run on original hardware of the time, though I find a setting of 300 has the best overall feel. You can also adjust the machine type to CGA or Tandy to ensure that those modes are used compared to the EGA mode, depending on how you want the palette cycling feature to function. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 197 will be on Saturday, September 10th, and I'll be taking a look at a curious game, which is kinda like if you took the Cannon Fodder game and made it medieval. And if you think you know of a game which is even remotely like that, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned to see how this concept could even work at all. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.